Chapter 8. We stopped under the willows by Kempton Park and lunched. It is a pretty little spot there, a pleasant grass plateau running along by the water's edge and overhung by willows. We had just commenced the third course, the bread and jam, when a gentleman in shirt-sleeves and a short pipe came along and wanted to know if we knew that we were trespassing. We said we hadn't given the matter sufficient consideration as yet to enable us to arrive at a definite conclusion on that point, but that if he assured us upon his word as a gentleman that we were trespassing, we would, without further hesitation, believe it. He gave us the required assurance, and we thanked him, but he still hung about, and seemed to be dissatisfied, so we asked him if there was anything further that we could do for him, and Harris, who is of a chummy disposition, offered him a bit of bread and jam. I fancy he must have belonged to some society sworn to abstain from bread and jam, for he declined it quite gruffly, as if he were vexed at being tempted with it, and he added that it was his duty to turn us off. Harris said that if it was a duty, it ought to be done, and asked the man what was his idea with regard to the best means for accomplishing it. Harris is what you would call a well-made man of about number 1 size, and looks hard and bony, and the man measured him up and down, and said he would go and consult his master, and then come back and chuck us both into the river. Of course we never saw him any more, and of course all he really wanted was a shilling. There are a certain number of riverside roughs who make quite an income during the summer by slouching about the banks and blackmailing weak-minded noodles in this way. They represent themselves as sent by the proprietor. The proper course to pursue is to offer your name and address, and leave the owner, if he really has anything to do with the matter, to summon you and prove what damage you have done to his land by sitting down on a bit of it. But the majority of people are so intensely lazy and timid that they prefer to encourage the imposition by giving in to it, rather than put an end to it by the exertion of a little firmness. Where it is really the owners that are to blame, they ought to be shown up. The selfishness of the riparian proprietor grows with every year. If these men had their way, they would close the River Thames altogether. They actually do this along the minor tributary streams and in the backwaters. They drive posts into the bed of the stream and draw chains across from bank to bank and nail huge notice boards on every tree. The sight of those notice boards rouses every evil instinct in my nature. I feel I want to tear each one down and hammer it over the head of the man who put it up until I have killed him, and then I would bury him and put the board up over the grave as a tombstone. I mentioned these feelings of mine to Harris, and he said he had them worse than that. He said he not only felt he wanted to kill the man who caused the board to be put up, but that he should like to slaughter the whole of his family and all his friends and relations, and then burn down his house. This seemed to me to be going too far, and I said so to Harris, but he answered, "Not a bit of it, serve 'em all, jolly well right, and I'd go and sing comic songs on the ruins." I was vexed to hear Harris go on in this bloodthirsty strain. We never ought to allow our instincts of justice to degenerate into mere vindictiveness. It was a long while before I could get Harris to take a more Christian view of the subject, but I succeeded at last, and he promised me that he would spare the friends and relations at all events, and would not sing comic songs on the ruins. You have never heard Harris sing a comic song, or you would understand the service I had rendered to mankind. It is one of Harris's fixed ideas that he can sing a comic song. The fixed idea, on the contrary, among those of Harris's friends who have heard him try, is that he can't and never will be able to, and that he ought not to be allowed to try. When Harris is at a party and is asked to sing, he replies, "Well, I can only sing a comic song, you know." And he says it in a tone that implies that his singing of that, however, is a thing that you ought to hear once and then die. "Oh, that is nice," says the hostess. "Do sing one, Mr. Harris." And Harris gets up and makes for the piano with the beaming cheeriness of a generous-minded man who is just about to give somebody something. "Now, silence, please, everybody," says the hostess, turning round. "Mr. Harris is going to sing a comic song." "Oh, how jolly," they murmur, and they hurry in from the conservatory and come up from the stairs and go and fetch each other from all over the house and crowd into the drawing-room and sit round, all smirking in anticipation. Then Harris begins. Well, you don't look for much of a voice in a comic song. You don't expect correct phrasing or vocalization. You don't mind if a man does find out when in the middle of a note that he is too high and comes down with a jerk. You don't bother about time. You don't mind a man being 2 bars in front of the accompaniment and easing up in the middle of a line to argue it out with the pianist and then starting the verse afresh. But you do expect the words. You don't expect a man to never remember more than the first 3 lines of the first verse and to keep on repeating these until it is time to begin the chorus. You don't expect a man to break off in the middle of a line and snigger and say, "It's very funny, but he's blessed if he can think of the rest of it," and then try and make it up for himself, and afterwards suddenly recollect it when he has got to an entirely different part of the song and break off without a word of warning to go back and let you have it then and there. You don't... Well, I will just give you an idea of Harris's comic singing, and then you can judge of it for yourself. Harris, standing up in front of piano and addressing the expectant mob. "I'm afraid it's a very old thing, you know. I expect you all know it, you know. But it's the only thing I know. It's the Judge's song out of Pinafore. No, I don't mean Pinafore. I mean, well, you know what I mean. The other thing, you know. You must all join in the chorus, you know." Murmurs of delight and anxiety to join in the chorus. Brilliant performance of prelude to the Judge's song in Trial by Jury by nervous pianist. Moment arrives for Harris to join in. Harris takes no notice of it. Nervous pianist commences prelude over again, and Harris, commencing singing at the same time, dashes off the first 2 lines of the first Lord's song out of Pinafore. Nervous pianist tries to push on with prelude, gives up, and tries to follow Harris with accompaniment to Judge's song out of Trial by Jury, finds that doesn't answer, and tries to recollect what he is doing and where he is, feels his mind giving way, and stops short. Harris, with kindly encouragement, "It's all right, you're doing it very well indeed. Go on." Nervous pianist, "I'm afraid there's a mistake somewhere. What are you singing?" Harris, promptly, "Why, the Judge's song out of Trial by Jury, don't you know it?" Some friend of Harris's, from the back of the room, "No, you're not, you chucklehead, you're singing the Admiral's song from Pinafore." Long argument between Harris and Harris's friend as to what Harris is really singing. Friend finally suggests that it doesn't matter what Harris is singing so long as Harris gets on and sings it. And Harris, with an evident sense of injustice rankling inside him, requests pianist to begin again. Pianist thereupon starts prelude to the Admiral's song, and Harris, seizing what he considers to be a favourable opening in the music, begins. Harris, "When I was young and called to the bar..." General roar of laughter, taken by Harris as a compliment. Pianist, thinking of his wife and family, gives up the unequal contest and retires, his place being taken by a stronger-nerved man. The new pianist, cheerily, "Now then, old man, you start off and I'll follow. We won't bother about any prelude." Harris, upon whom the explanation of matters has slowly dawned, laughing, "By Jove! Oh, I beg your pardon. Of course I've been mixing up the 2 songs. It was Jenkins confused me, you know. Now then." Singing, his voice appearing to come from the cellar and suggesting the first low warnings of an approaching earthquake. "When I was young I served a term as office boy to an attorney's firm." Aside to pianist, "It's too low, old man. We'll have that over again if you don't mind." Sings first 2 lines over again, in a high falsetto this time. Great surprise on the part of the audience. Nervous old lady near the fire begins to cry and has to be led out. "I swept the windows and I swept the door and..." No, I cleaned the windows of the big front door and I polished up the... No, dash it, I beg your pardon. It's a funny thing, I can't think of that line, and I... Oh, well, we'll get on to the chorus and chance it. sings, "And I diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle-dee, till now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy." Now then, chorus, it's the last two lines repeated, you know. General chorus, "And he diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle-dee, till now he is the ruler of the Queen's Navy." And Harris never sees what an ass he is making of himself, and how he is annoying a lot of people who never did him any harm. He honestly imagines that he has given them a treat, and says he will sing another comic song after supper. Speaking of comic songs and parties, reminds me of a rather curious incident at which I once assisted, which, as it throws much light upon the inner mental working of human nature in general, ought, I think, to be recorded in these pages. We were a fashionable and highly cultured party. We had on our best clothes, and we talked pretty, and were very happy. All except two young fellows, students, just returned from Germany, commonplace young men who seemed restless and uncomfortable, as if they found the proceedings slow. The truth was, we were too clever for them. Our brilliant but polished conversation and our high-class tastes were beyond them. They were out of place among us. They never ought to have been there at all. Everybody agreed upon that, later on. We played morceaux from the old German masters. We discussed philosophy and ethics. We flirted with graceful dignity. We were even humorous, in a high-class way. Somebody recited a French poem after supper, and we said it was beautiful. And then a lady sang a sentimental ballad in Spanish, and it made one or two of us weep. It was so pathetic. And then those two young men got up and asked us if we had ever heard of Herr Slossenboschen, who'd just arrived and was then down in the supper-room sing his great German comic song. None of us had heard it that we could remember. The young men said it was the funniest song that had ever been written, and that if we liked, they would get Herr Slossenboschen, whom they knew very well, to sing it. They said it was so funny that when Herr Slossenboschen had sung it once before the German Emperor, he, the German Emperor, had had to be carried off to bed. They said nobody could sing it like Herr Slossenboschen. He was so intensely serious all through it that you might fancy he was reciting a tragedy, and that, of course, made it all the funnier. They said he never once suggested by his tone or manner that he was singing anything funny. That would spoil it. It was his air of seriousness, almost of pathos, that made it so irresistibly amusing. We said we yearned to hear it, that we wanted a good laugh, and they went downstairs and fetched Herr Slossenboschen. He appeared to be quite pleased to sing it, for he came up at once and sat down to the piano without another word. "Oh, it will amuse you, you will laugh," whispered the two young men as they passed through the room, and took up an unobtrusive position behind the professor's back. Herr Slossenboschen accompanied himself. The prelude did not suggest a comic song exactly. It was a weird, soulful air. It quite made one's flesh creep, but we murmured to one another that it was the German method, and prepared to enjoy it. I don't understand German myself. I learned it at school, but forgot every word of it 2 years after I had left, and have felt much better ever since. Still, I did not want the people there to guess my ignorance, so I hit upon what I thought to be rather a good idea. I kept my eye on the two young students, and followed them. When they tittered, I tittered. When they roared, I roared. And I also threw in a little snigger all by myself now and then, as if I'd seen a bit of humour that had escaped the others. I consider this particularly artful on my part. I noticed, as the song progressed, that a good many other people seemed to have their eye fixed on the two young men, as well as myself. These other people also tittered when the young men tittered, and roared when the young men roared. And as the two young men tittered and roared and exploded with laughter pretty continuously all through the song, it went exceedingly well. And yet that German professor did not seem happy. At first, when we began to laugh, the expression of his face was one of intense surprise, as if laughter were the very last thing he'd expected to be greeted with. We thought this very funny. We said his earnest manner was half the humour, The slightest hint on his part that he knew how funny he was would have completely ruined it all. As we continued to laugh, his surprise gave way to an air of annoyance and indignation, and he scowled fiercely round upon us all, except upon the two young men, who, being behind him, he could not see. That sent us into convulsions. We told each other that it would be the death of us, this thing. The words alone, we said, were enough to send us into fits, but added to his mock seriousness, it was too much. In the last verse, he surpassed himself. He glowered round upon us with a look of such concentrated ferocity that, but for our being forewarned as to the German method of comic singing, we should have been nervous, and he threw such a wailing note of agony into the weird music that if we had not known it was a funny song, we might have wept. He finished amid a perfect shriek of laughter. We said it was the funniest thing we had ever heard in all our lives. We said how strange it was that in the face of things like these there should be a popular notion that the Germans hadn't any sense of humour. And we asked the professor why he didn't translate the song into English, so that the common people could understand it and hear what a real comic song was like. Then Herr Slossenboschen got up and went on awful. He swore at us in German, which I should judge to be a singularly effective language for that purpose, and he danced and shook his fist and called us all the English he knew. He said he had never been so insulted in all his life. It appeared that the song was not a comic song at all. It was about a young girl who lived in the Harz Mountains and who had given up her life to save her lover's soul, and he died and met her spirit in the air. And then, in the last verse, he jilted her spirit and went off with another spirit. I'm not quite sure of the details, but it was something very sad, I know. Herr Boschen said he had sung it once before the German Emperor, and he, the German Emperor, had sobbed like a little child. He, Herr Boschen, said it was generally acknowledged to be one of the most tragic and pathetic songs in the German language. It was a trying situation for us, very trying. There seemed to be no answer. We looked around for the two young men who had done this thing, but they had left the house in an unostentatious manner immediately after the end of the song. That was the end of that party. I never saw a party break up so quietly, and with so little fuss. We never said good night, even to one another. We came downstairs, one at a time, walking softly and keeping the shady side. We asked the servant for our hats and coats in whispers, and opened the door for ourselves, and slipped out and got round the corner quickly, avoiding each other as much as possible. I have never taken much interest in German songs since then. We reached Sunbury Lock at 3:30. The river is sweetly pretty just there before you come to the gates, and the backwater is charming, but don't attempt to row up it. I tried to do so once. I was sculling and asked the fellows who were steering if they thought it could be done, and they said, oh, yes, they thought so if I pulled hard. We were just under the little footbridge that crosses it between the two weirs when they said this, and I bent down over the sculls and set myself up and pulled. I pulled splendidly. I got well into a steady, rhythmical swing. I put my arms and my legs and my back into it. I set myself a good, quick, dashing stroke and worked in really grand style. My two friends said it was a pleasure to watch me. At the end of 5 minutes, I thought we ought to be pretty near the weir, and I looked up. We were under the bridge in exactly the same spot that we were when I began, and there were those two idiots injuring themselves by violent laughing. I have been grinding away like mad to keep that boat stuck still under that bridge. I let other people pull up backwaters against strong streams now. We sculled up to Walton, a rather large place for a riverside town. As with all riverside places, only the tiniest corner of it comes down to the water, so that from the boat you might fancy it was a village of some half-dozen houses, all told. Windsor and Abingdon are the only towns between London and Oxford that you can really see anything of from the stream. All the others hide round corners and merely peep at the river down one street. My thanks to them for being so considerate and leaving the river banks to woods and fields and waterworks. Even Reading, though it does its best to spoil and sully and make hideous as much of the river as it can reach, is good-natured enough to keep its ugly face a good deal out of sight. Caesar, of course, had a little place at Walton, a camp or an entrenchment or something of that sort. Caesar was a regular up-river man. Also Queen Elizabeth, she was there too. You can never get away from that woman, go where you will. Cromwell and Bradshaw, not the guide man, but the King Charles's head man, likewise sojourned here. They must have been quite a pleasant little party altogether. There is an iron scold's bridle in Walton Church. They used these things in ancient days for curbing women's tongues. They've given up the attempt now. I suppose iron was getting scarce, and nothing else would be strong enough. There are also tombs of note in the church, and I was afraid I should never get Harris past them, but he didn't seem to think of them, and we went on. Above the bridge, the river winds tremendously. This makes it look picturesque, but it irritates you from a towing or sculling point of view, and causes argument between the man who is pulling and the man who is steering. You pass Oatlands Park on the right bank here. It is a famous old place. Henry VIII stole it from someone or the other, I forget whom now, and lived in it. There is a grotto in the park which you can see for a fee, and which is supposed to be very wonderful, but I cannot see much in it myself. The late Duchess of York, who lived at Oatlands, was very fond of dogs, and kept an immense number. She had a special graveyard made in which to bury them when they died, and there they lie, about 50 of them, with a tombstone over each, and an epitaph inscribed thereon. Well, I dare say they deserve it quite as much as the average Christian does. At Corway Stakes, the first bend above Walton Bridge, was fought a battle between Caesar and Cassivelaunus. Cassivelaunus had prepared the river for Caesar by planting it full of stakes, and had no doubt put up a notice board. But Caesar crossed in spite of this. You couldn't choke Caesar off that river. He's the sort of man we want round the backwaters now. Halliford and Shepperton are both pretty little spots where they touch the river, but there is nothing remarkable about either of them. There is a tomb in Shepperton churchyard, however, with a poem on it, and I was nervous lest Harris should want to get out and fool round it. I saw him fix a longing eye on the landing stage as we drew near it, so I managed by an adroit movement to jerk his cap into the water, and in the excitement of recovering that, and his indignation at my clumsiness, he forgot all about his beloved graves. At Weybridge, the Wey, a pretty little stream, navigable for small boats up to Guildford, and one which I've always been making up my mind to explore and never have, the Bourne, and the Basingstoke Canal all enter the Thames together. The lock is just opposite the town, and the first thing that we saw when we came in view of it was George's blazer on one of the lock gates, closer inspection showing that George was inside it. Montmorency set up a furious barking. I shrieked, Harris roared. George waved his hat and yelled back. The lock-keeper rushed out with a drag, under the impression that somebody had fallen into the lock, and appeared annoyed at finding that no one had. George had a rather curious oilskin-covered parcel in his hand. It was round and flat at one end, with a long straight handle sticking out of it. "What's that?" said Harris. "A frying pan?" "No," said George, with a strange wild look glittering in his eyes. "They're all the rage this season. Everybody's got them up the river. It's a banjo." "I never knew you played the banjo," cried Harris and I in one breath. "Not exactly," replied George, "but it's very easy, they tell me. And I've got the instruction book." Chapter 9. We made George work, now we had got him. He did not want to work, of course, that goes without saying. He had had a hard time in the city, so he explained. Harris, who is callous in his nature and not prone to pity, said, and now you're going to have a hard time on the river for a change. A change is good for everyone. Out you get. He could not in conscience, not even George's conscience, object, though he did suggest that perhaps it would be better for him to stop in the boat and get tea ready while Harris and I towed, because getting tea was such a worrying work, and Harris and I looked tired. The only reply we made to this, however, was to pass him over the tow-line, and he took it and stepped out. There is something very strange and unaccountable about a tow-line. You roll it up with as much patience and care as you would take to fold up a new pair of trousers, and 5 minutes afterwards, when you pick it up, it is one ghastly, soul-revolting tangle. I do not wish to be insulting, but I firmly believe that if you took an average tow-line and stretched it out straight across the middle of a field, and then turned your back on it for 30 seconds, that when you looked round again, you would find that it had got itself all together in a heap in the middle of the field, and had twisted itself up and tied itself into knots, and lost its two ends, and become all loops. And it would take you a good half-hour, sitting down there on the grass, and swearing all the while, to disentangle it again. That is my opinion of tow-lines in general. Of course, there may be honourable exceptions. I do not say that there are not. There may be tow-lines that are a credit to their profession, conscientious, respectable tow-lines that do not imagine they are crochet work and try to knit themselves up into antimacassars the instant they are left to themselves. I say there may be such tow-lines. I sincerely hope there are, but I have not met with them. This tow-line I had taken in myself just before we had got to the lock. I would not let Harris touch it because he is careless. I had looped it round, slowly and cautiously, and tied it up in the middle and folded it in two, and laid it down gently at the bottom of the boat. Harris had lifted it up scientifically, and had put it into George's hand. George had taken it firmly, and had held it away from him, and had begun to unravel it as if he were taking the swaddling clothes off a newborn infant, and before he had unwound a dozen yards, the thing was more like a badly made doormat than anything else. It is always the same, and the same sort of thing always goes on in connection with it. The man on the bank who is trying to disentangle it thinks all the fault lies with the man who rolled it up, and when a man up the river thinks a thing, he says it. What have you been trying to do with it? Make a fishing net of it? You've made a nice mess, you have. Why couldn't you wind it up properly, you silly dummy? He grunts from time to time as he struggles wildly with it, and lays it out flat on the towpath, and runs round and round it, trying to find the end. On the other hand, the man who wound it up thinks the whole cause of the muddle rests with the man who is trying to unwind it. "It was all right when you took it," he exclaims indignantly. "Why don't you think what you're doing? You go about things in such a slapdash style. You'd get a scaffolding pole entangled, you would." And they feel so angry with one another that they would like to hang each other with the thing. 10 minutes go by, and the first man gives a yell and goes mad and dances on the rope and tries to pull it straight by seizing hold of the first piece that comes to his hand and hauling at it. Of course, this only gets it into a tighter tangle than ever. Then the second man climbs out of the boat and comes to help him, and they get in each other's way and hinder one another. They both get hold of the same bit of line and pull at it in opposite directions and wonder where it is caught. In the end, they do get it clear, and then turn round and find that the boat has drifted off and is making straight for the weir. This really happened once, to my own knowledge. It was up by Boveny, one rather windy morning. We were pulling downstream, and as we came round the bend, we noticed a couple of men on the bank. They were looking at each other with as bewildered and helplessly miserable expression as I have ever witnessed on any human countenance before or since, and they held a long tow-line between them. It was clear that something had happened, so we eased up and asked them what was the matter. "Why, our boat's gone off," they replied in an indignant tone. "We just got out to disentangle the tow-line, and when we looked round it was gone." And they seemed hurt at what they evidently regarded as a mean and ungrateful act on the part of the boat. We found the truant for them half a mile further down, held by some rushes, and we brought it back to them. I bet they did not give that boat another chance for a week. I shall never forget the picture of those two men walking up and down the bank with a tow line, looking for their boat. One sees a good many funny incidents up the river in connection with towing. One of the most common is the sight of a couple of towers walking briskly along, deep in animated discussion, while the man in the boat, 100 yards behind them, is vainly shrieking to them to stop and making frantic signs of distress with a scull. Something has gone wrong. The rudder has come off, or the boat hook has slipped overboard, or his hat has dropped into the water and is floating rapidly downstream. He calls to them to stop, quite gently and politely at first. "Hi, stop a minute, will you?" he shouts cheerily. "I've dropped my hat overboard." Then, "Hi, Tom, Dick, can't you hear?" Not quite so affably this time. Then, "Hi, confound you, you dunder-headed idiots! Hi, stop! Oh, you!" After that he springs up and dances about and roars himself red in the face and curses everything he knows. And the small boys on the bank stop and jeer at him and pitch stones at him as he's pulled along past them at the rate of 4 miles an hour and can't get out. Much of this sort of trouble would be saved if those who are towing would keep remembering that they are towing and give a pretty frequent look round to see how their man is getting on. It is best to let one person tow. When two are doing it, they get chattering and forget, and the boat itself, offering as it does but little resistance, is of no real service in reminding them of the fact. As an example of how utterly oblivious a pair of towers can be to their work, George told us, later on in the evening, when we were discussing the subject after supper, of a very curious instance. He and 3 other men, so he said, were sculling a very heavily laden boat up from Maidenhead one evening, and a little above Cookham Lock they noticed a fellow and a girl walking along the towpath, both deep in an apparently interesting and absorbing conversation. They were carrying a boat hook between them, and attached to the boat hook was a tow line which trailed behind them, its end in the water. No boat was near, no boat was in sight. There must have been a boat attached to that tow line at some time or other, that was certain. But what had become of it, what ghastly fate had overtaken it, and those who'd been left in it, was buried in mystery. Whatever the accident may have been, however, it had in no way disturbed the young lady and gentleman who were towing. They had the boat hook and they had the line, and that seemed to be all that they thought necessary to their work. George was about to call out and wake them up, but at that moment a bright idea flashed across him, and he didn't. He got the hitcher instead, and reached over and drew in the end of the tow line, and they made a loop in it and put it over their mast, and then they tidied up the sculls and went and sat down in the stern and lit their pipes. And that young man and young woman towed those 4 hulking chaps and a heavy boat up to Marlow. George said he never saw so much thoughtful sadness concentrated into one glance before, as when, at the lock, that young couple grasped the idea that for the last 2 miles they'd been towing the wrong boat. George fancied that if it had not been for the restraining influence of the sweet woman at his side, the young man might have given way to violent language. The maiden was the first to recover from her surprise, and when she did, she clasped her hands and said wildly, "Oh, Henry, then where is Auntie?"
"Did they ever recover, the old lady?" asked Harris.
George replied he did not know. Another example of the dangerous want of sympathy between tower and towed was witnessed by George and myself once up near Walton. It was where the towpath shelves gently down into the water, and we were camping on the opposite bank, noticing things in general. By and by, a small boat came in sight, towed through the water at a tremendous pace by a powerful barge horse, on which sat a very small boy. Scattered about the boat, in dreamy and reposeful attitudes, lay 5 fellows, the man who was steering having a particularly restful appearance. "I should like to see him pull the wrong line," murmured George as they passed. And at that precise moment the man did it, and the boat rushed up the bank with a noise like the ripping up of 40,000 linen sheets. 2 men, a hamper, and 3 oars immediately left the boat on the larboard side and reclined on the bank, and 1.5 moments afterwards 2 other men disembarked from the starboard and sat down among boat hooks and sails and carpet bags and bottles. The last man went on 20 yards further and then got out on his head. This seemed to sort of lighten the boat, and it went on much easier, the small boy shouting at the top of his voice and urging his steed into a gallop. The fellows sat up and stared at one another. It was some seconds before they realized what had happened to them, but when they did, they began to shout lustily for the boy to stop. He, however, was too much occupied with the horse to hear them, and we watched them flying after him until the distance hid them from view. I cannot say I was sorry at their mishap. Indeed, I only wish that all the young fools who have their boats towed in this fashion, and plenty do, could meet with similar misfortunes. Besides the risk they run themselves, they become a danger and an annoyance to every other boat they pass. Going at the pace they do, it is impossible for them to get out of anybody else's way, or for anybody else to get out of theirs. Their line gets hitched across your mast and overturns you, or it catches somebody in the boat and either throws them into the water or cuts their face open. The best plan is to stand your ground and be prepared to keep them off with the butt end of a mast. Of all experiences in connection with towing, the most exciting is being towed by girls. It is a sensation that nobody ought to miss. It takes 3 girls to tow, always. 2 hold the rope, and the other one runs round and giggles. They generally begin by getting themselves tied up. They get the line round their legs and have to sit down on the path and undo each other, and then they twist it round their necks and are nearly strangled. They fix it straight, however, at last, and start off at a run, pulling the boat along at quite a dangerous pace. At the end of 100 yards, they're naturally breathless and suddenly stop, and all sit down on the grass and laugh, and your boat drifts out to midstream and turns round before you know what has happened or can get hold of a scull. Then they stand up and are surprised. "Oh, look," they say, "he's gone right out into the middle." They pull on pretty steadily for a bit after this, and then it all at once occurs to one of them that she will pin up her frock, and they ease up for the purpose, and the boat runs aground. You jump up and push it off, and you shout to them not to stop. "Yes, what's the matter?" they shout back. "Don't stop," you roar. "Don't what?" "Don't stop, go on, go on." "Go back, Emily, and see what it is they want," says one, and Emily comes back and asks what it is. "What do you want?" she says. "Anything happened?" "No," you reply. "It's all right, only go on, you know. Don't stop." "Why not?" "Why, we can't steer if you keep stopping. You must keep some way on the boat." "Keep some what?" "Some way. You must keep the boat moving." "Oh, all right, I'll tell 'em. Are we doing it all right?" "Oh, yes, very nicely indeed. Only don't stop." "It doesn't seem difficult at all. I thought it was so hard." "Oh, no. It's simple enough. You want to keep on steady at it, that's all." "I see. Give me out my red shawl. It's under the cushion." You find the shawl and hand it out, and by this time another one has come back and thinks she will have hers too, and they take Mary's on chance, and Mary does not want it, so they bring it back and have a pocket comb instead. It is about 20 minutes before they get off again, and at the next corner they see a cow, and you have to leave the boat to chivvy the cow out of their way. There is never a dull moment in the boat while girls are towing it. George got the line right after a while, and towed us steadily on to Penton Hook. There we discussed the important question of camping. We had decided to sleep on board that night, and we had either to lay up just about there or go on past Staines. It seemed early to think about shutting up then, however, with the sun still in the heavens, and we settled to push straight on for Runnymede, 3.5 miles further, a quiet wooded part of the river, and where there is good shelter. We all wished, however, afterward, that we had stopped at Penton Hook. 3 or 4 miles upstream is a trifle early in the morning, but it is a weary pull at the end of a long day. You take no interest in the scenery during these last few miles. You do not chat and laugh. Every half-mile you cover seems like 2. You can hardly believe you are only where you are, and you are convinced that the map must be wrong. And when you've trudged along for what seems to you at least 10 miles, and still the loch is not in sight, You begin seriously to fear that somebody must have sneaked it and run off with it. I remember being terribly upset once up the river, in a figurative way, I mean. I was out with a young lady, cousin on my mother's side, and we were pulling down to Goring. It was rather late, and we were anxious to get in. At least, she was anxious to get in. It was 6:30 when we reached Benson's Lock, and dusk was drawing on, and she began to get excited then. She said she must be in to supper. I said it was a thing I felt I wanted to be in at too, and I drew out a map I had with me to see exactly how far it was. I saw it was just 1.5 miles to the next lock, Wallingford, and 5 on from there to Cleeve. "Oh, it's all right," I said. "We'll be through the next lock before 7, and then there is only one more." And I settled down and pulled steadily away. We passed the bridge, and soon after that I asked if she saw the lock. She said no, she did not see any lock, and I said, "Oh," and pulled on. Another 5 minutes went by, and then I asked her to look again. "No," she said, "I can't see any signs of a lock." You're sure you know a lock when you do see one?" I asked hesitatingly, not wishing to offend her. The question did offend her, however, and she suggested that I'd better look for myself, so I laid down the sculls and took a view. The river stretched out straight before us in the twilight for about 1 mile. Not a ghost of a lock was to be seen. "You don't think we have lost our way, do you?" asked my companion. I did not see how that was possible, though, as I suggested, we might have somehow got into the Weir stream and be making for the falls. This idea did not comfort her in the least, and she began to cry. She said we should both be drowned, and that it was a judgment on her for coming out with me. It seemed an excessive punishment, I thought, but my cousin thought not, and hoped it would all soon be over. I tried to reassure her and to make light of the whole affair. I said that the fact evidently was that I was not rowing as fast as I fancied I was, but that we should soon reach the lock now, and I pulled on for another mile. Then I began to get nervous myself. I looked again at the map. There was Wallingford Lock, clearly marked 1.5 miles below Benson's. It was a good, reliable map, and besides, I recollected the lock myself. I'd been through it twice. Where were we? What had happened to us? I began to think it must be all a dream, and that I was really asleep in bed and should wake up in a minute and be told it was past 10. I asked my cousin if she thought it could be a dream, and she replied that she was just about to ask me the same question. And then we both wondered if we were both asleep, and if so, who was the real one that was dreaming, and who was the one that was only a dream. It got quite interesting. I still went on pulling, however, and still no lock came in sight, and the river grew more and more gloomy and mysterious under the gathering shadows of night, and things seemed to be getting weird and uncanny. I thought of hobgoblins and banshees, and will-o'-the-wisps, and those wicked girls who sit up all night on rocks and lure people into whirlpools and things. And I wished I had been a better man, and knew more hymns. And in the middle of these reflections I heard the blessed strains of "He's Got 'em On" played badly on a concertina, and knew that we were saved. I do not admire the tones of a concertina as a rule, but oh, how beautiful the music seemed to us both then. Far, far more beautiful than the voice of Orpheus or the lute of Apollo, or anything of that sort could have sounded. Heavenly melody, in our then state of mind, would only have still further harrowed us. A soul-moving harmony, correctly performed, we should have taken as a spirit warning and have given up all hope. But about the strains of "He's Got 'em On," jerked spasmodically and with involuntary variations out of a wheezy accordion, there was something singularly human and reassuring. The sweet sounds drew nearer, and soon the boat from which they were worked lay alongside us. It contained a party of provincial Aries and Ariots out for a moonlight sail. There was not any moon, but that was not their fault. I never saw more attractive, lovable people in all my life. I hailed them and asked if they could tell me the way to Wallingford Lock, and I explained that I'd been looking for it for the last 2 hours. "Wallingford Lock?" they answered. "Lord love you, sir, that's been done away with for over a year. There ain't no Wallingford Lock now, sir. You're close to Cleeve now. Blow me tight if here ain't a gentleman been looking for Wallingford Lock, Bill." I had never thought of that. I wanted to fall upon all their necks and bless them, but the stream was running too strong just there to allow of this, so I had to content myself with mere cold-sounding words of gratitude. We thanked them over and over again, and we said it was a lovely night, and we wished them a pleasant trip, and I think invited them all to come and spend a week with me, and my cousin said her mother would be so pleased to see them. And we sang the soldiers' chorus out of Faust, and got home in time for supper, after all. Chapter 10. Harris and I began to think that Belweir Lock must have been done away with after the same manner. George had towed us up to Staines, and we'd taken the boat from there, and it seemed that we were dragging 50 tons after us, and were walking 40 miles. It was 7:30 when we were through, and we all got in and sculled up close to the left bank, looking out for a spot to haul up in. We had originally intended to go on to Magna Carta Island, a sweetly pretty part of the river where it winds through a soft green valley, and to camp in one of the many picturesque inlets to be found round that tiny shore. But somehow we did not feel that we yearned for the picturesque nearly so much now as we had earlier in the day. A bit of water between a coal barge and a gasworks would have quite satisfied us for that night. We did not want scenery. We wanted to have our supper and go to bed. However, we did pull up to the point, picnic point it is called, and dropped into a very pleasant nook under a great elm tree, to the spreading roots of which we fastened the boat. Then we thought we were going to have supper. We had dispensed with tea so as to save time, but George said no, that we'd better get the canvas up first before it got quite dark, and while we could see what we were doing. Then, he said, all our work would be done, and we could sit down to eat with an easy mind. The canvas wanted more putting up than I think any of us had bargained for. It looked so simple in the abstract. You took 5 iron arches, like gigantic croquet hoops, and fitted them up over the boat, and then stretched the canvas over them and fastened it down. It would take quite 10 minutes, we thought. That was an underestimate. We took up the hoops and began to drop them into the sockets placed for them. You would not imagine this to be dangerous work, but looking back now, the wonder to me is that any of us are alive to tell the tale. They were not hoops, they were demons. First, they would not fit into their sockets at all, and we had to jump on them and kick them and hammer at them with the boat hook, and when they were in, it turned out that they were the wrong hoops for those particular sockets, and they had to come out again. But they would not come out until 2 of us had gone and struggled with them for 5 minutes, when they would jump up suddenly and try and throw us into the water and drown us. They had hinges in the middle, and when we were not looking, they nipped us with these hinges in delicate parts of the body. And while we were wrestling with one side of the hoop and endeavouring to persuade it to do its duty, the other side would come behind us in a cowardly manner and hit us over the head. We got them fixed at last, and then all that was to be done was to arrange the covering over them. George unrolled it and fastened one end over the nose of the boat. Harris stood in the middle to take it from George and roll it onto me, and I kept by the stern to receive it. It was a long time coming down to me. George did his part all right, but it was new work to Harris, and he bungled it. How he managed it I do not know. He could not explain it himself, but by some mysterious process or other, he succeeded, after 10 minutes of superhuman effort, in getting himself completely rolled up in it. He was so firmly wrapped round and tucked in and folded over that he could not get out. He, of course, made frantic struggles for freedom, the birthright of every Englishman, and in doing so, I learned this afterwards, knocked over George, and then George, swearing at Harris, began to struggle too, and got himself entangled and rolled up. I knew nothing about all this at the time. I did not understand the business at all myself. I had been told to stand where I was and wait till the canvas came to me, and Montmorency and I stood there and waited, both as good as gold. We could see the canvas being violently jerked and tossed about pretty considerably, but we supposed this was part of the method, and did not interfere. We also heard much smothered language coming from underneath it, and we guessed that they were finding the job rather troublesome, and concluded that we would wait until things got a little simpler before we joined in. We waited some time, but matters seemed to get only more and more involved, until at last George's head came wriggling out over the side of the boat, and spoke up. It said, "Give us a hand here, can't you, you cuckoo? Standing there like a stuffed mummy when you see we're both being suffocated, you dummy!" I never could withstand an appeal for help, so I went and undid them. Not before it was time, either, for Harris was nearly black in the face. It took us half an hour's hard labour after that before it was properly up, and then we cleared the decks and got out supper. We put the kettle on to boil up in the nose of the boat, and went down to the stern and pretended to take no notice of it, but set to work to get the other things out. That is the only way to get a kettle to boil up the river. If it sees that you are waiting for it and are anxious, it will never even sing. You have to go away and begin your meal as if you were not going to have any tea at all. You must not even look round at it. Then you will soon hear it sputtering away, mad to be made into tea. It is a good plan, too, if you're in a great hurry, to talk very loudly to each other about how you don't need any tea and are not going to have any. You get near the kettle so that it can overhear you, and then you shout out, "I don't want any tea, do you, George?" To which George shouts back, "Oh no, I don't like tea. We'll have lemonade instead. Tea's so indigestible." Upon which the kettle boils over and puts the stove out. We adopted this harmless bit of trickery, and the result was that by the time everything else was ready, the tea was waiting. Then we lit the lantern and squatted down to supper. We wanted that supper. For 35 minutes, not a sound was heard throughout the length and breadth of that boat, save the clank of cutlery and crockery and the steady grinding of 4 sets of molars. At the end of 35 minutes, Harris said, "Ah," and took his left leg out from under him and put his right one there instead. 5 minutes afterwards, George said, "Ah," too, and threw his plate out on the bank, and 3 minutes later than that, Montmorency gave the first sign of contentment he'd exhibited since we had started, and rolled over on his side and spread his legs out. And then I said, "Ah," and bent my head back and bumped it against one of the hoops, but I did not mind it. I did not even swear. How good one feels when one is full. How satisfied with ourselves and with the world. People who have tried it tell me that a clear conscience makes you very happy and contented, but a full stomach does the business quite as well, and is cheaper and more easily obtained. One feels so forgiving and generous after a substantial and well-digested meal, so noble-minded, so kindly-hearted. It is very strange, this domination of our intellect by our digestive organs. We cannot work, we cannot think, unless our stomach wills so. It dictates to us our emotions, our passions. After eggs and bacon, it says, "Work." After beefsteak and porter, it says, "Sleep." After a cup of tea, 2 spoonfuls for each cup, and don't let it stand for more than 3 minutes, it says to the brain, "Now rise and show your strength. Be eloquent and deep and tender. See with a clear eye into nature and into life. Spread your white wings of quivering thought and soar, a godlike spirit, over the whirling world beneath you, up through long lanes of flaming stars to the gates of eternity." After hot muffins, it says, "Be dull and soulless, like a beast of the field, a brainless animal with listless eye, unlit by any ray of fancy or of hope or fear or love or life." And after brandy, taken in sufficient quantity, it says, Now come, fool, grin and tumble, that your fellow men may laugh, drivel in folly, and splutter in senseless sounds, and show what a helpless ninny is poor man, whose wit and will are drowned like kittens, side by side, in half an inch of alcohol. We are but the veriest, sorriest slaves of our stomach. Reach not after morality and righteousness, my friends. Watch vigilantly your stomach, and diet it with care and judgment. Then virtue and contentment will come and reign within your heart, unsought by any effort of your own, and you will be a good citizen, a loving husband, and a tender father, a noble, pious man. Before our supper, Harris and George and I were quarrelsome and snappy and ill-tempered. After our supper, we sat and beamed on one another. And we beamed upon the dog, too. We loved each other. We loved everybody. Harris, in moving about, trod on George's corn. Had this happened before supper, George would have expressed wishes and desires concerning Harris's fate in this world and the next that would have made a thoughtful man shudder. As it was, he said, "Steady, old man, wear wheat." And Harris, instead of merely observing in his most unpleasant tones that a fellow could hardly help treading on some bit of George's foot if he had to move about at all within 10 yards of where George was sitting, suggesting that George never ought to come into an ordinary-sized boat with feet that length, and advising him to hang them over the side, as he would have done before supper, now said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, old chap, I hope I haven't hurt you." And George said, "Not at all, that it was his fault." And Harris said, "No, it was his." It was quite pretty to hear them. We lit our pipes and sat looking out on the quiet night and talked. George said, why could not we be always like this, away from the world with its sin and temptation, leading sober, peaceful lives and doing good? I said it was the sort of thing I had often longed for myself, and we discussed the possibility of our going away, we four, to some handy, well-fitted desert island, and living there in the woods. Harris said that the danger about desert islands, as far as he had heard, was that they were so damp, but George said no, not if properly drained. And then we got on to drains, and that put George in mind of a very funny thing that happened to his father once. He said his father was travelling with another fellow through Wales, and one night they stopped at a little inn where there were some other fellows, and they joined the other fellows and spent the evening with them. They had a very jolly evening and sat up late, and by the time they came to go to bed, this was when George's father was a very young man, were slightly jolly too. They, George's father and George's father's friend, were to sleep in the same room, but in different beds. They took the candle and went up. The candle lurched up against the wall when they got into the room and went out, and they had to undress and grope into bed in the dark. This they did, but instead of getting into separate beds, as they thought they were doing, both climbed into the same one without knowing it, one getting in with his head at the top, and the other crawling in from the opposite side of the compass and lying with his feet on the pillow. There was silence for a moment, and then George's father said, "Joe?" "What's the matter, Tom?" replied Joe's voice from the other end of the bed. "Why, there's a man in my bed," said George's father. "Here's his feet on my pillow." "Well, it's an extraordinary thing, Tom," answered the other, "but I'm blessed if there isn't a man in my bed, too." "What are you going to do?" asked George's father. "Well, I'm going to chuck him out," replied Joe. "So am I," said George's father valiantly. There was a brief struggle, followed by 2 heavy bumps on the floor, and then a rather doleful voice said, "I say, Tom." "Yes?" "How have you got on?" "Well, to tell you the truth, my man's chucked me out." "So's mine. I say, I don't think much of this inn, do you?" "What was the name of that inn?" said Harris. "The Pig and Whistle," said George. "Why?" "Ah, no, then it isn't the same," replied Harris. "What do you mean?" queried George. "Why, it's so curious," murmured Harris, "that precisely that very same thing happened to my father once at a country inn. I've often heard him tell the tale. I thought it might have been the same inn." We turned in at 10 that night. and I thought I should sleep well, being tired, but I didn't. As a rule, I undress and put my head on the pillow, and then somebody bangs at the door and says it is 8:30. But tonight everything seemed against me. The novelty of it all, the hardness of the boat, the cramped position. I was lying with my feet under one seat and my head on another, the sound of the lapping of the water round the boat, and the wind among the branches kept me restless and disturbed. I did get to sleep for a few hours, and then some part of the boat, which seemed to have grown up in the night, for it certainly was not there when we started, and it had disappeared by the morning, kept digging into my spine. I slept through it for a while, dreaming that I had swallowed a sovereign, and that they were cutting a hole in my back with a gimlet so as to try and get it out. I thought it very unkind of them, and I told them I would owe them the money, and they should have it at the end of the month. But they would not hear of that, and said it would be much better if they had it then, because otherwise the interest would accumulate so. I got quite cross with them after a bit, and told them what I thought of them, and then they gave the gimlet such an excruciating wrench that I woke up. The boat seemed stuffy, and my head ached, so I thought I would step out into the cool night air. I slipped on what clothes I could find about, some of my own and some of George's and Harris's, and crept under the canvas onto the bank. It was a glorious night. The moon had sunk and left the quiet earth alone with the stars. It seemed as if, in the silence and the hush, while we, her children, slept, they were talking with her, their sister, conversing of mighty mysteries, in voices too vast and deep for childish human ears to catch the sound. They awe us, these strange stars, so cold, so clear. We are as children whose small feet have strayed into some dim-lit temple of the God they have been taught to worship, but know not. And standing where the echoing dome spans the long vista of the shadowy light, glance up, half hoping, half afraid to see some awful vision hovering there. And yet it seems so full of comfort and of strength, the night. In its great presence our small sorrows creep away ashamed. The day has been so full of fret and care, and our hearts have been so full of evil and bitter thoughts, and the world has seemed so hard and wrong to us. Then night, like some great loving mother, gently lays her hand upon our fevered head, and turns our little tear-stained face up to hers, and smiles, and though she does not speak, we know what she would say, and lay our hot-flushed cheek against her bosom. And the pain is gone. Sometimes our pain is very deep and real, and we stand before her very silent, because there is no language for our pain, only a moan. Night's heart is full of pity for us. She cannot ease our aching. She takes our hand in hers, and the little world grows very small and very far away beneath us, and, borne on her dark wings, we pass for a moment into a mightier presence than her own, and in the wondrous light of that great presence, all human life lies like a book before us, and we know that pain and sorrow are but the angels of God. Only those who have worn the crown of suffering can look upon that wondrous light, and they, when they return, may not speak of it, or tell the mystery they know. Once upon a time, through a strange country, there rode some goodly knights, and their path lay by a deep wood where tangled briars grew very thick and strong, and tore the flesh of them that lost their way therein. And the leaves of the trees that grew in the wood were very dark and thick, so that no ray of light came through the branches to lighten the gloom and sadness. And as they passed by that dark wood, one knight of those that rode, missing his comrades, wandered far away, and returned to them no more. And they, sorely grieving, rode on without him, mourning him as one dead. Now, when they reached the fair castle towards which they had been journeying, they stayed there many days, and made merry. And one night, as they sat in cheerful ease around the logs that burned in the great hall, and drank a loving measure, there came the comrade they had lost, and greeted them. His clothes were ragged like a beggar's, and many sad wounds were on his sweet flesh. But upon his face there shone a great radiance of deep joy. And they questioned him, asking him what had befallen him, and he told them how in the dark wood he had lost his way, and had wandered many days and nights, till, torn and bleeding, he had lain him down to die. Then, when he was nigh unto death, lo, through the savage gloom there came to him a stately maiden, and took him by the hand, and led him on through devious paths unknown to any man, until upon the darkness of the wood there dawned a light, such as the light of day was unto but as a little lamp unto the sun. And in that wondrous light our wayworn knight saw, as in a dream, a vision, and so glorious, so fair the vision seemed, that of his bleeding wounds he thought no more, but stood as one entranced, whose joy is deep as is the sea, whereof no man can tell the depth. And the vision faded, and the knight, kneeling upon the ground, thanked the good saint who into that sad wood had strayed his steps, so he had seen the vision that lay there hid. And the name of the dark forest was Sorrow, but of the vision that the good knight saw therein we may not speak or tell. Chapter 11. I woke at 6 the next morning and found George awake too. We both turned round and tried to go to sleep again, but we could not. Had there been any particular reason why we should not have gone to sleep again, but have got up and dressed then and there, we should have dropped off while we were looking at our watches, and have slept till 10. As there was no earthly necessity for our getting up under another 2 hours at the very least, and our getting up at that time was an utter absurdity, it was only in keeping with the natural cussedness of things in general that we should both feel that lying down for 5 minutes more would be death to us. George said the same kind of thing, only worse, had happened to him some 18 months ago, when he was lodging by himself in the house of a certain Mrs. Gippings. He said his watch went wrong one evening and stopped at 8:15. He did not know this at the time, because, for some reason or other, he forgot to wind it up when he went to bed, an unusual occurrence with him, and hung it up over his pillow without ever looking at the thing. It was in the winter when this happened, very near the shortest day, and a week of fog into the bargain, so the fact that it was still very dark when George woke in the morning was no guide to him as to the time. He reached up and hauled down his watch. It was 8:15. "Angels and ministers of grace defend us!" exclaimed George. "And here have I got to be in the city by 9. Why didn't somebody call me? Oh, this is a shame!" And he flung the watch down and sprang out of bed and had a cold bath and washed himself and dressed himself and shaved himself in cold water because there was not time to wait for the hot, and then rushed and had another look at the watch. Whether the shaking it had received in being thrown down on the bed had started it, or how it was, George could not say, but certain it was that from 8:15 it had begun to go, and now pointed to 20 minutes to 9. George snatched it up and rushed downstairs. In the sitting-room all was dark and silent. There was no fire, no breakfast. George said it was a wicked shame of Mrs. G, and he made up his mind to tell her what he thought of her when he came home in the evening. Then he dashed on his greatcoat and hat, and seizing his umbrella, made for the front door. The door was not even unbolted. George anathematized Mrs. G for a lazy old woman, and thought it was very strange that people could not get up at a decent, respectable time, unlocked and unbolted the door, and ran out. He ran hard for a quarter of a mile, and at the end of that distance it began to be borne in upon him as a strange and curious thing that there were so few people about, and that there were no shops open. It was certainly a very dark and foggy morning, but still it seemed an unusual course to stop all business on that account. He had to go to business. Why should other people stop in bed merely because it was dark and foggy? At length he reached Holborn. Not a shutter was down. Not a bus was about. There were 3 men in sight, one of whom was a policeman, a market cart full of cabbages, and a dilapidated-looking cab. George pulled out his watch and looked at it. It was 5 minutes to 9. He stood still and counted his pulse. He stooped down and felt his legs. Then, with his watch still in his hand, he went up to the policeman and asked him if he knew what the time was. "What's the time?" said the man, eyeing George up and down with evident suspicion. "Why, if you listen, you will hear it strike." George listened, and a neighbouring clock immediately obliged. "But it's only gone 3, said George in an injured tone when it had finished. "Well, and how many did you want it to go?" replied the constable. "Why, 9, said George, showing his watch. "Do you know where you live?" said the guardian of public order severely. George thought, and gave the address. "Oh, that's where it is it?" replied the man. "Well, you take my advice and go there quietly, and take that watch of yours with you, and don't let's have any more of it." And George went home again, musing as he walked along, and let himself in. At first, when he got in, he determined to undress and go to bed again. But when he thought of the redressing and re-washing and the having of another bath, he determined he would not, but would sit up and go to sleep in the easy chair. But he could not get to sleep. He never felt more wakeful in his life. So he lit the lamp and got out the chessboard and played himself a game of chess. But even that did not enliven him. It seemed slow somehow, so he gave chess up and tried to read. He did not seem able to take any sort of interest in reading either, so he put on his coat again and went out for a walk. It was horribly lonesome and dismal, and all the policemen he met regarded him with undisguised suspicion, and turned their lanterns on him and followed him about, and this had such an effect upon him at last that he began to feel as if he really had done something, and he got to slinking down the by-streets and hiding in dark doorways when he heard the regulation flip-flop approaching. Of course, this conduct made the force only more distrustful of him than ever, and they would come and rout him out and ask him what he was doing there. And when he answered nothing, he'd merely come out for a stroll, it was then 4 o'clock in the morning, they looked as though they did not believe him, and 2 plain-clothes constables came home with him to see if he really did live where he had said he did. They saw him go in with his key, and then took up a position opposite, and watched the house. He thought he would light the fire when he got inside, and make himself some breakfast, just to pass away the time. But he did not seem able to handle anything from a scuttleful of coals to a teaspoon without dropping it or falling over it, and making such a noise that he was in mortal fear that it would wake Mrs. G up, and that she would think it was burglars, and open the window and call "Police!" And then these 2 detectives would rush in and handcuff him, and march him off to the police court. He was in a morbidly nervous state by this time, and he pictured the trial, and his trying to explain the circumstances to the jury, and nobody believing him, and his being sentenced to 20 years penal servitude, and his mother dying of a broken heart. So he gave up trying to get breakfast, and wrapped himself up in his overcoat and sat in the easy chair till Mrs. G came down at 7:30. He said he had never got up too early since that morning. It had been such a warning to him. We had been sitting huddled up in our rugs while George had been telling me this true story, and on his finishing it, I set to work to wake up Harris with a skull. The 3rd prod did it, and he turned over on the other side and said he would be down in a minute and that he would have his lace-up boots. We soon let him know where he was, however, by the aid of the hitcher, and he sat up suddenly, sending Montmorency, who'd been sleeping the sleep of the just right on the middle of his chest, sprawling across the boat. Then we pulled up the canvas, and all four of us poked our heads out over the offside and looked down at the water and shivered. The idea overnight had been that we should get up early in the morning, fling off our rugs and shawls, and, throwing back the canvas, spring into the river with a joyous shout, and revel in a long, delicious swim. Somehow, now the morning had come, the notion seemed less tempting. The water looked damp and chilly. The wind felt cold.
"Well, who's going to be first in?" said Harris at last.
There was no rush for precedence. George settled the matter so far as he was concerned by retiring into the boat and pulling on his socks. Montmorency gave vent to an involuntary howl, as if merely thinking of the thing had given him the horrors, and Harris said it would be so difficult to get into the boat again, and went back and sorted out his trousers. I did not altogether like to give in, though I did not relish the plunge. There might be snags about, or weeds, I thought. I meant to compromise matters by going down to the edge and just throwing the water over myself. So I took a towel and crept out on the bank and wormed my way along to the branch of a tree that dipped down into the water. It was bitterly cold. The wind cut like a knife. I thought I would not throw the water over myself after all. I would go back into the boat and dress. And I turned to do so, and as I turned, the silly branch gave way, and I and the towel went in together with a tremendous splash, and I was out midstream with a gallon of Thames water inside me before I knew what had happened.
"By Jove, old Jay's gone in,"
I heard Harris say as I came blowing to the surface.
"I didn't think he'd have the pluck to do it, did you?"
"Is it all right?" sung out George. "Lovely," I spluttered back. "You are duffers not to come in. I wouldn't have missed this for worlds. Why don't you try it? It only wants a little determination." But I could not persuade them. Rather an amusing thing happened while dressing that morning. I was very cold when I got back into the boat, and in my hurry to get my shirt on, I accidentally jerked it into the water. It made me awfully wild, especially as George burst out laughing. I could not see anything to laugh at, and I told George so, and he only laughed the more. I never saw a man laugh so much. I quite lost my temper with him at last, and I pointed out to him what a drivelling maniac of an imbecile idiot he was, but he only roared the louder. And then, just as I was landing the shirt, I noticed that it was not my shirt at all, but George's, which I'd mistaken for mine. Whereupon the humour of the thing struck me for the first time, and I began to laugh, and the more I looked from George's wet shirt to George roaring with laughter, the more I was amused, and I laughed so much that I had to let the shirt fall back into the water again. "Aren't you going to get it out?" said George between his shrieks. I could not answer him at all for a while. I was laughing so, but at last, between my peals, I managed to jerk out, "It isn't my shirt. It's yours." I never saw a man's face change from lively to severe so suddenly in all my life before. "What?" he yelled, springing up. "You silly cuckoo! Why can't you be more careful what you're doing? Why the deuce don't you go and dress on the bank? You're not fit to be in a boat, you're not. Give me the hitcher." I tried to make him see the fun of the thing, but he could not. George is very dense at seeing a joke sometimes. Harris proposed that we should have scrambled eggs for breakfast. He said he would cook them. It seemed from his account that he was very good at doing scrambled eggs. He often did them at picnics and went out on yachts. He was quite famous for them. People who had once tasted his scrambled eggs, so we gathered from his conversation, never cared for any other food afterwards, but pined away and died when they could not get them. It made our mouths water to hear him talk about the things, and we handed him out the stove and the frying pan and all the eggs that had not smashed and gone over everything in the hamper, and begged him to begin. He had some trouble in breaking the eggs. or rather not so much trouble in breaking them exactly, as in getting them into the frying pan when broken, and keeping them off his trousers, and preventing them from running up his sleeve, but he fixed some half a dozen into the pan at last, and then squatted down by the side of the stove and chivied them about with a fork. It seemed harassing work, so far as George and I could judge. Whenever he went near the pan, he burned himself, and then he would drop everything and dance round the stove, flicking his fingers about and cursing the things. Indeed, every time George and I looked round at him, he was sure to be performing this feat. We thought, at first, that it was a necessary part of the culinary arrangements. We did not know what scrambled eggs were, and we fancied that it must be some Red Indian or Sandwich Islands sort of dish that required dances and incantations for its proper cooking. Montmorency went and put his nose over it once, and the fat spluttered up and scalded him, and then he began dancing and cursing. Altogether, it was one of the most interesting and exciting operations I have ever witnessed. George and I were both quite sorry when it was over. The result was not altogether the success that Harris had anticipated. There seemed so little to show for the business. 6 eggs had gone into the frying pan, and all that came out was a teaspoonful of burnt and unappetizing-looking mess. Harris said it was the fault of the frying pan, and thought it would have gone better if we'd had a fish kettle and a gas stove, and we decided not to attempt the dish again until we had those aids to housekeeping by us. The sun had got more powerful by the time we had finished breakfast, and the wind had dropped, and it was as lovely a morning as one could desire. Little was in sight to remind us of the 19th century, and as we looked out upon the river in the morning sunlight, we could almost fancy that the centuries between us and that ever-to-be-famous June morning of 1215 had been drawn aside, and that we, English yeomen's sons in homespun cloth, with dirk at belt, were waiting there to witness the writing of that stupendous page of history, the meaning whereof was to be translated to the common people some 400 and odd years later by one Oliver Cromwell, who had deeply studied it. It is a fine summer morning, sunny, soft, and still, but through the air there runs a thrill of coming stir. King John has slept at Duncroft Hall, and all the day before, the little town of Staines has echoed to the clang of armed men, and the clatter of great horses over its rough stones, and the shouts of captains, and the grim oaths and surly jests of bearded bowmen, billmen, pikemen, and strange-speaking foreign spearmen. Gay-cloaked companies of knights and squires have ridden in, all travel-stained and dusty, and all the evening long the timid townsmen's doors have had to be quick-opened to let in rough groups of soldiers, for whom there must be found both board and lodging, and the best of both, or woe betide the house and all within. For the sword is judge and jury, plaintiff and executioner in these tempestuous times, and pays for what it takes by sparing those from whom it takes it, if it pleases it to do so. Round the campfire in the marketplace gather still more of the baron's troops, and eat and drink deep, and bellow forth roistering drinking songs, and gamble and quarrel as the evening grows and deepens into night. The firelight sheds quaint shadows on their piled-up arms, and on their uncouth forms. The children of the town steal round to watch them, wondering, and brawny country wenches, laughing, draw near to bandy alehouse jest and jibe with the swaggering troopers, so unlike the village swains, who, now despised, stand apart behind, with vacant grins upon their broad, peering faces. And out from the fields around glitter the faint lights of more distant camps, as here some great lord's followers lie mustered, and there false John's French mercenaries hover like crouching wolves without the town. And so, with sentinel in each dark street, and twinkling watchfires on each height around, the night has worn away, and over this fair valley of old Tame has broken the morning of the great day that is to close so big with the fate of ages yet unborn. Ever since grey dawn, in the lower of the 2 islands, just above where we're standing, there has been great clamour, and the sound of many workmen. The great pavilion brought there yestereve is being raised, and carpenters are busy nailing tiers of seats, while prentices from London town are there with many-coloured stuffs, and silks, and cloth of gold, and silver. And now, lo, down upon the road that winds along the river's bank from Staines, there come towards us, laughing and talking together in deep guttural bass, 50 of stalwart halbert men, barons' men these, and halt at 100 yards or so above us on the other bank, and lean upon their arms, and wait. And so, from hour to hour, march up along the road ever fresh groups and bands of armed men, their casques and breastplates flashing back along the low, long lines of morning sunlight, until, as far as I can reach, the way seems thick with glittering steel, and prancing steeds, and shouting horsemen are galloping from group to group, and little banners are fluttering lazily in the warm breeze, and every now and then there is a deeper stir, as the ranks make way on either side, and some great baron on his war-horse, with his guard of squires around him, passes along to take his station at the head of his serfs and vassals. And up the slope of Cooper's Hill, just opposite, are gathered the wondering rustics and curious townsfolk, who have run from Staines and are none quite sure what the bustle is about, but each one has a different version of the great event that they have come to see, and some say that much good to all the people will come from this day's work. But the old men shake their heads, for they have heard such tales before. And all the river down to Staines is dotted with small craft and boats and tiny coracles, which last are growing out of favour now and are used only by the poorer folk. Over the rapids, where in after years trim Bell-Weir Lock will stand, they have been forced or dragged by their sturdy rowers, and now are crowding up as near as they dare come to the great covered barges, which lie in readiness to bear King John to where the fateful charter waits his signing. It is noon, and we and all the people have been waiting patient for many an hour, and the rumour has run round that Slippery John has again escaped from the Baron's grasp, and has stolen away from Duncroft Hall with his mercenaries at his heels, and will soon be doing other work than signing charters for his people's liberty. Not so. This time the grip upon him has been one of iron, and he has slid and wriggled in vain. Far down the road a little cloud of dust has risen, and draws nearer and grows larger, and the pattering of many hoofs grows louder, and in and out between the scattered groups of drawn-up men there pushes on its way a brilliant cavalcade of gay-dressed lords and knights, and front and rear and either flank there ride the yeomen of the barons, and in the midst King John. He rides to where the barges lie in readiness, and the great barons step forth from their ranks to meet him. He greets them with a smile and laugh, and pleasant honeyed words, as though it were some feast in his honour to which he had been invited. But as he rises to dismount, he casts one hurried glance from his own French mercenaries drawn up in the rear to the grim ranks of the baron's men that hem him in. Is it too late? One fierce blow at the unsuspecting horseman at his side, one cry to his French troops, one desperate charge upon the unready lines before him, and these rebellious barons might rue the day they dared to thwart his plans. A bolder hand might have turned the game even at that point. Had it been a Richard there, the cup of liberty might have been dashed from England's lips, and the taste of freedom held back for 100 years. But the heart of King John sinks before the stern faces of the English fighting men, and the arm of King John drops back onto his rein, and he dismounts and takes his seat in the foremost barge, and the barons follow in with each mailed hand upon the sword hilt, and the word is given to let go. Slowly the heavy, bright-decked barges leave the shore of Running Mead. Slowly, against the swift current, they work their ponderous way, till, with a low grumble, they grate against the bank of the little island, that from this day will bear the name of Magna Carta Island. and